Let's talk about the tax cut bill that was passed in the final weeks of 2010 by the Congress and signed by President Obama. What that bill did was extend the tax cuts that had come down from the Bush administration for at least another couple years. That prevented taxes from rising, that would have automatically risen, not only for average Americans, but for the richest amongst us too. And that was supposed to help the economy because we have an economic crisis and we don't want to withdraw purchasing power from our people by taxing them. In addition, this bill gave businesses further tax cuts and said to the average American, we will reduce the amount we pull out of Social Security, out of your check for Social Security, as well for the entire year 2011. All of this is to stimulate our economy out of the crisis. Let's take a look at this bill because it raises profound questions about the United States that we ought to answer. First, this bill represents an admission by the government and by our leading politicians of something they try to hide most of the time. The reason you have to keep stimulating the American economy is that all the previous efforts of the government, bailing out the banks, bailing out General Motors, giving away money to all sorts of more or less corrupt institutions that had failed as private enterprises, it didn't work. The earlier stimulus didn't work. That's why we have to keep doing more, because it didn't work. And it doesn't take a genius to at least ask the question, if what we did in the past didn't work, will doing more of the same guarantee us a way out of this crisis? I don't think so, and I think the absence of a real debate in this country about it is not a good sign. Let's go further. Let's ask about what happened here. First, we decided not to tax rich people. Instead, we continued with the old tax cuts, added new tax cuts, added new cuts on Social Security withholding. All that means is the government has to go further in debt. It's being asked to do all it did before, even more, but it's being withheld from getting the tax revenues it needs. So the government is going to have to borrow. And when it has to borrow, guess who it goes to borrow from? The very rich people, the very corporations who will be able to lend to the government because the government didn't tax them. They basically got the best deal imaginable. Instead of being taxed, they get to lend money to the government, which pays it back to them with interest. What's the problem here? The problem here is that we could and should stimulate our economy, but we don't need to go into debt as a nation to do it. We ought to tax business and the richest 5% of our people to pay for it. After all, that's the American way if you think about it. The wealthy and the business communities are the ones most responsible for bringing this crisis about. Everyone knows that. They are the ones whose wealth has insulated them from the costs and suffering of this crisis more than everybody else. Everyone knows that too. And because those are the folks who own the banks and who own the shares traded on the stock market, the last year's recovery of the stock market has meant many of them have recovered from the crisis in a way that the average Americans haven't, which is why we need these stimuluses. They're the most able to pay, they were least hurt by the crisis, they were most responsible for the crisis, and they've enjoyed the greatest recovery. If there was ever an argument that they ought to be made to pay to clean up the crisis they caused, it's now. This tax bill that was passed doesn't do that. It gives them a pass yet again. And it puts the burden of paying for this crisis on the mass of people who will have to cover the government's deficit, rather than putting it where it belongs, on those most able to pay who have been evading their fair share of the responsibility in our society for far too long.